one by one, 250 feet deep in the ocean after diving into the Mount Everest of shipwrecks. These 3 seasoned divers chased luxury porcelain plates, but found themselves in a desperate fight for survival. What began as the ultimate test of skill became one of the deadliest wreck diving seasons in history. What happened next is truly terrifying. On June 23, 1998, in Montauk, New York, Craig Sicola boarded the Seeker, a small charter ship headed for the wreck of the Andrea Doria with several experienced divers. Once at the dive site, Craig and others readied their equipment and started their descent to the wreck below. As always, the Seeker's skipper, Dan Crowell, warned the divers to stay on the ship's exterior during their first dive, to get familiar with the wreck and water conditions, especially since they had several days to explore it. However, despite the warning, and driven by the determination to retrieve the Doria's highly desired fine china, Craig would soon make a decision he would quickly regret. As he descended, Craig deployed his yellow guideline, made from lightweight nylon, to easily find his way back. But in his eagerness, he apparently lost track of the time and would now need to ascend quickly or he would run out of breathing gas. So he tied his nylon rope to the wreck and set a float toward the surface to mark his location and guide his ascent. But as Craig followed the line, strong currents whipped it around, entangling him and forcing another diver to come to his aid and cut him free. Despite this terrifying experience, Craig remained determined to explore the Doria and didn't hesitate to go back the same day. The SS Andrea Doria was a luxury Italian transatlantic ocean liner that began her maiden voyage in 1953. With a capacity of about 1,200 passengers and 500 crew, and equipped with modern radar technology, she was known as Italy's largest, fastest, and supposedly safest ship at the time. But during the Doria's 51st transatlantic voyage, disaster struck. On the evening of July 25, 1956, as the Andrea Doria approached New York, a dense Atlantic fog led to a collision with the outgoing MS Stockholm, 52 miles off the coast of Nantucket Island. The Stockholm featured a steel-reinforced bow which tore into the Doria's hull, breaching multiple watertight compartments and overwhelming the ship's design. 51 people were killed following the impact, and as the water rapidly flooded the lower sections, the Doria developed a severe starboard list, the very side it would ultimately settle on when it sank 11 hours later. But even on the ocean floor, the Doria's death toll kept rising. The wreck's highest point rests at approximately 160 feet beneath the Atlantic Ocean, with its lowest reaching 250 feet. At these depths, the extreme atmospheric pressure compresses the gases divers breathe, so it's critical that divers follow a pre-planned gas trimix for each stage of the dive. Failing to do so can lead to too much nitrogen or oxygen entering the bloodstream, resulting in nitrogen narcosis or even death from oxygen toxicity. This meant Craig would need to ascend slowly and carefully to avoid causing serious harm to his body. To make it even worse, the wreck lies in a strong Atlantic current, surrounded by frigid water with temperatures around 41 degrees Fahrenheit or 5 degrees Celsius. The combination of these conditions is why the site is often referred to as the Mount Everest of diving. One of the most valued items was the fine china from the dining areas, as the dishware was marked with the ship's name and served as a trophy to prove a diver had reached deep inside the wreck. But like Everest, many who chased it paid the ultimate price. Later that afternoon, Craig re-entered the water for a second dive, this time with a man named Paul Whitaker. Due to the complexity of their dive, they had only around 20 minutes to explore the inside of the wreck before needing to start their 60-minute ascent to decompress safely. The pair slowly descended and soon reached the ship, locating Gimbel's Hole, an 8-by-20-foot opening cut into the hull by filmmaker Peter Gimbel in 1981, which has since become the main entrance into the ship's interior. Paul had planned to stick close to the entrance, but Craig had other ideas. In pitch darkness, he turned right into the hallway and led Paul to a storeroom rumored to contain first-class china. However, in their excitement, they had overshot their destination by about 10 feet and were forced to turn back. Paul urgently signaled Craig with his flashlight, and the pair frantically made their way back toward Gimbel's Hole, kicking up rust and silt as they went, barely making it out in time. Paul surfaced at 5:02 p.m. and scrambled aboard the Seeker, with Craig arriving 18 minutes later, disappointed to come back empty-handed. However, other divers emerged with pristine pieces of first-class china and refused to tell Craig the location. Frustrated by their secrecy, Craig spent the evening studying the Doria's deck plans and came up with a risky plan that would soon turn into a nightmare. When the Andrea Doria went down, countless stories, artifacts, and pieces of history were lost forever. It's a reminder of how fragile knowledge can be, and the knowledge we preserve determines how we rebuild. That's where The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding Civilization comes in. It's a book with step-by-step instructions on how to actually rebuild modern society from scratch, from purifying water and growing food to generating electricity, making medicine, and restoring communication, all presented in a unique, illustrated style. However, this isn't just a book. Hidden within its pages is a quest with puzzles that, once completed, will give you access to a group called the Order of Seekers, plus a mystery reward. Only 7 people in the world have solved it so far. Explore The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding Civilization yourself and become potentially number 8, or get it as a gift using the link in the description. The next morning on June 24th, the divers prepared their gear once more and began entering the water. However, Craig dragged out his preparations and began his descent 10 minutes after Paul at 10:37. He wanted to explore the wreck alone. When Craig reached the Doria at 10:45, Paul was exiting the wreck from Gimbel's Hole. They exchanged the OK signal, and Paul headed to the Seeker's anchor line to ascend. Craig, meanwhile, descended into Gimbel's Hole and headed straight towards the kitchen at the rear of the ship. Wearing 200 pounds of equipment, he passed through the windowless dining room in complete darkness and kicked on until he reached a depth of 226 feet when he entered the kitchen. Immediately, Craig managed to dig out 3 pieces of first-class china from the silt. After placing them in a mesh bag on his equipment harness, he turned around to exit the ship. But Craig realized he'd made a big mistake. He was too deep inside the wreck at the bottom of the dining room and had disturbed too much silt. With his visibility now almost zero, he desperately tried to find Gimbel's Hole and somehow managed to exit the ship. But Craig couldn't locate the Seeker's anchor line and far exceeded his bottom time limit, leaving no time for proper decompression stops. With no other option, Craig risked catastrophic decompression sickness and inflated a lift bag, which he tied to his emergency rope. He completed an hour-long ascent in a matter of minutes. The atmospheric pressure exerted on his body rapidly decreased from nearly 7 atmospheres to 1, causing expanding nitrogen bubbles to wreak havoc inside his body, triggering excruciating pain. At 11:22 a.m., his lift bag surfaced and was reeled in by the Seeker. However, the cord was severed at 150 feet, and Craig was nowhere in sight. While the Seeker's crew waited anxiously, he finally surfaced at 11:22 a.m., 10 minutes after his lift bag. He was face down, unresponsive, and frothing at the mouth. The Seeker's crew noticed that his face was blue and blotchy, with bloodshot eyes, which were signs of severe decompression sickness. They tried to revive him, but their efforts failed, and Craig was later pronounced dead at Massachusetts General Hospital at 2:09 p.m. at the age of 32. But it didn't stop there. 2 weeks later, Richard Roost Jr. headed to the Doria, boarding the Seeker on July 7, 1998. As a diving veteran, Richard knew about Craig's death, but was unfazed by the recent tragedy. His 25 years of experience included helping the police with underwater searches, and he was unofficially known as the Scuba God for his ability to get more air out of a tank than any of his peers. Even Dan Crowell, the Seeker's captain, noted Richard's good judgment and natural ability underwater. But all that was about to be put to the ultimate test. As the owner of a dive shop in Michigan, finding first-class china from the Doria was one of the things Richard hadn't done in the world of diving. He was supposed to dive the Doria wreck in the summer of 1997, but his trip was canceled due to bad weather. So throughout the winter, Richard meticulously studied the Doria's deck plans, plotted dive routes, ran trimix calculations, and perfected his equipment setup. He'd even brought a color printer aboard the Seeker to print dive notes from his laptop. If anyone had the chance of safely finding china, it was Richard. But the other divers noticed something was wrong. Richard had driven for 9 hours throughout the night and looked fatigued. He was also uncharacteristically seasick when the rest of the divers anticipated the find of a lifetime. Days earlier, a man named Vincent Napoliello found 20 pieces of china inside the Doria. However, Vince had run out of time to retrieve the pieces and planned to return later that summer to claim them. The rumor of an unclaimed hoard spread excitement across the Seeker's divers. By the time they reached the Doria, the so-called China fever was at an all-time high. At 10:27 a.m., Richard entered the water with 2 other Doria first-timers. The trio descended to the shipwreck together, reaching the Doria within 4 minutes and moved along the promenade deck. One of the divers briefly dipped into an open doorway to test his mettle. Richard, however, didn't follow. Instead, he heeded Dan Crowell's advice to stick to the outside of the ship. After completing their decompression during the ascent, the other divers were amazed at how smoothly Richard moved underwater and noted that he didn't take unnecessary risks. But this was only the test run. Richard knew entering the ship would be far more challenging. So after checking his gear and refilling his tanks, Richard chose not to dive again that day. Instead, he planned to find the same closet Craig had visited on his fatal dive just a few weeks earlier. The next morning, on July 8th, Richard geared up and entered the water alone at 7:59 a.m. He quickly descended to the wreck and made his way through Gimbel's Hole. Since Richard had studied the route so thoroughly, he reached the closet without issue and collected a cup and 3 saucers decorated with the maroon and gold braid, which confirmed it was first-class china. Richard then made his way back outside to the promenade deck and entered the ship once more to make mental notes of the wreck's landmarks and reference points. When Richard surfaced, he was surprised at how easy the dive was, telling Dan Crowell how the many windows and doorways on the promenade deck reassured him, saying, "It's not like you can get lost in there." However, he had spoken too soon. Later that day, at 1:02 p.m., Richard entered the water for his 3rd dive of the trip, alone again, intending to explore the ship's swimming pools. He planned 25 minutes of bottom time exploration, with a total dive time of 80 minutes. Richard told the crew that if everything went well, he should be back at around 2:20 p.m. and disappeared beneath the waves. But this time was different. He had no idea that something was about to go terribly, terribly wrong. 6 minutes into his dive at 1:10 p.m., Richard entered Gimbel's Hole and retrieved more china from the first-class closet shortly after. Around this time, another diver, Steve Berman, entered the ocean above the Doria. He expected to see Richard during their decompression stops on the ascent. However, when he pulled himself onto the Seeker at 2:38 p.m., he knew something wasn't right. Richard was nowhere in sight. It is now nearly 10 minutes after his scheduled resurfacing time, and every second counted. At 2:43 p.m., Crowell's crew marked him as overdue and radioed another dive ship, Wahoo, who was stationed nearby to check if Richard had maybe ascended their anchor line mistakenly. However, Richard isn't on Wahoo's anchor line, and none of its divers could confirm his whereabouts. With each passing minute, the chances of survival slipped further away. The situation was dire. Meanwhile, the crew desperately tried to figure out where Richard could be. They feared he may have been swept out to sea as he ascended the Seeker. Crowell immediately sent out an urgent rescue call to the Coast Guard, but everyone knew that Richard must have depleted his gas by now. By 6:30 p.m., a Coast Guard helicopter scanned the ocean for any sign of Richard, while 2 teams of volunteers went below to find Richard. Some of the last divers to surface before Richard vanished saw a large amount of silt by Gimbel's Hole, so one of the groups searched the area, while the second investigated the swimming pools. Despite 3 teams searching, they couldn't locate him, and by 8 p.m., the Coast Guard search operation had to be called off. The following morning, on July 5th, the Coast Guard resumed searches at 5:15 a.m., and a group of 15 divers entered the water at 9:37 a.m., completing a comprehensive search of the common diving spots inside the Doria. After finding no trace inside the ship, his strobe light was eventually found at the base of the Seeker's anchor line. Then, at 12:15 p.m., a pair of veteran divers with extensive knowledge of the Doria's interior, Gary Gentile and John Moyer, headed to the Doria's promenade deck and made a grim discovery. Richard's body was wedged between 2 tables in the cabin-class ballroom, 210 feet underwater. Despite having all the right gear, experience, and trimix, Richard used up all his air and drowned in the very area he said was impossible to get lost in. He was 45 years old. Dan Crowell could hardly believe both Craig and Richard had died just 2 weeks apart. But the nightmare wasn't over just yet. On the evening of August 3rd, 1998, nearly 4 weeks after Richard's death, the Seeker once again set out to the Doria, but this time with Vince Napoliello, the diver who'd found the hull of first-class China just days before Richard's final dive. Before leaving, he promised his fiancée, who was worried about his safety, that it would be his final trip to the wreck. Little did he know, it was about to be. Similar to Richard, Vince was a methodical man with extensive diving experience and knew the conditions well, since he'd visited the site multiple times. Although Vince completed his first dive the next day without incident, by 3 p.m. he was clearly distracted. The market was in freefall, which meant Vince, a Wall Street broker by trade, was on the phone with clients shortly before gearing up for his second dive. Despite the interruption, he quickly clipped on 5 steel cylinders of breathing gases, which he'd labeled to determine their mix. His 2 main tanks contained 17% oxygen, 30% helium, and 53% nitrogen, and were joined by an isolator valve which controlled the flow between them. Typically, divers breathe from both tanks at the same time, but the valve is a vital lifeline. If a tank malfunctions, shutting the valve is the only way to avoid losing their gas supply. Even more critical, though, were the 2 yellow tanks for Vince's decompression stops. One contained 36% oxygen for the deepest sections of decompression. The other had 80% and was only meant for near-surface use. If Vince accidentally inhaled too much oxygen, it would become toxic to his body, triggering seizures underwater, which are often fatal. But Vince made an error which was extremely out of character. His left tank was labeled 80% oxygen and his right tank 81.3%. The potentially fatal combination was noticed by his dive partner, Dennis Murphy. Vince, however, explained he'd used the 81.3% tank earlier that day and had since diluted it down to 36% oxygen without changing the label. Diving with correct labels is critical, particularly at depths below 100 feet. Even a perfect trimix cannot entirely prevent divers from experiencing nitrogen narcosis symptoms, where mental confusion makes even the slightest misjudgment lethal. Despite the risk, Vince left the labels as they were and began his descent with Dennis at 3:40 p.m. They dropped into the wreck through Gimbel's hull and began swimming to the ship's china closet. Digging through the silt, they each found a few pieces of china and had 8 minutes left of their planned 20 minutes of bottom dive time. Without warning, Vince ripped Dennis' regulator from his mouth, slid a finger over his throat, and pointed at Dennis's gas tanks. Stunned, Dennis grabbed his backup regulator, struggling to understand what was happening. Confused, he yelled if Vince was out of air. Vince shouted no several times, and shaking his head, pointing at Dennis's tanks once more. Now on the verge of panic, Dennis screamed, "Let's get the F out of here." They immediately made their way to the exit and emerged from the ship to begin their ascent. The Seeker's anchor line was towards the front of the Doria, but Vince turned towards its rear. At first, Dennis thought Vince was heading to the Sea Inn's anchor line by mistake. Another dive boat anchored close to the Seeker. However, Vince passed it within 2 feet and kept on swimming. Although Dennis was concerned about Vince's strange behavior, he had an even bigger problem. It was 4:03 p.m., 18 minutes into their planned bottom dive, and he had only 2 minutes left to get to the first decompression stop. Dennis ascended to 100 feet, watching Vince swim along the Doria's exterior, moving slowly to preserve energy. Vince hadn't used his ascent tanks yet, as their regulators were strapped in place. The last thing Dennis saw were bubbles rising over Vince's head as he vanished out of sight in the open ocean. 5 minutes later, at 4:08 p.m., the captain aboard the CN saw a diver roughly 50 feet away from his boat. The man was rolled on his hip, so at first he thought he was adjusting equipment. However, the diver remained face down and motionless. Divers on the CN brought him aboard and quickly started CPR. It was Vince. Immediately, one of them yelled out the incorrect oxygen labels on his ascension tanks, and everyone feared Vince had died from oxygen toxicity. But when one of the divers tested the tanks, they confirmed the 81.6% bottle contained 36% oxygen as Vince claimed it had. Other crew members then tested his main breathing tanks and discovered his regulator was closed. This meant Vince couldn't breathe from his second tank during his dive, and may have been the problem he was trying to explain to Dennis. Finally, the crew also discovered Vince's 80% oxygen ascension tank was only half full, which led them to suspect Vince had mistakenly inhaled the oxygen-rich gas at the incorrect stage of his ascent. But while they tried to piece together what happened, a frantic resuscitation effort was ongoing. Vince's eyes fluttered once more during more than 45 minutes of trying to revive him, until the Coast Guard arrived at 5:25 p.m. Vince was airlifted to Cape Cod Hospital, where his official cause of death was drowning. However, conflicting reports claim oxygen toxicity or a buildup of carbon dioxide, which triggered a massive heart attack, played a part in his grim fate. Vince was 32 years old.